Nick Wade was 20 when he made the most reckless decision of his life. It was the kind of decision that sent his parents, Beau and Sophia Wade, into fits of disbelief and disappointment. He married Lisa Daniels, his college sweetheart, against their stern advice. "You're too young," Sophia had said, pacing their sunlit kitchen in Maplewood, her voice tinged with frustration. "Marriage isn't a fairy tale, Nick." But Nick, blinded by the heady rush of young love, had dismissed their warnings. Lisa was everything he thought he wanted: beautiful, confident, and adventurous. They married in a small courthouse ceremony, with none of the fanfare Nick's parents had hoped for their only son. For a brief moment, life felt perfect. Lisa was charming and fun, and Nick loved the way she made him feel invincible. But perfection was fleeting. By their first anniversary, the cracks in their relationship had turned into chasms. Lisa cheated on him with a coworker, shattering Nick's naive belief in their love. Heartbroken and humiliated, Nick threw himself into his fledgling tech startup. What had begun as a side project in his college dorm became his lifeline. Late nights coding and early mornings pitching to investors kept him too busy to dwell on his failed marriage. 4 years later, Nick was unrecognizable from the heartbroken young man he'd been. His tech company, Wade Tech Solutions, was thriving. He'd built something substantial out of the ashes of his heartbreak, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was in control of his life. But then the call came. Nick was in his downtown office when his father's voice crackled through the phone. "Nick, your mother isn't well." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Sophia Wade was the strongest woman he knew, the backbone of their family. The thought of her being sick was almost unthinkable. "What happened?" Nick asked, his voice tight. "Heart issues," Beau replied. "She's stable now, but the doctors want her to take it easy. We could use your help at home." Nick didn't hesitate. He booked a flight to Maplewood and cleared his schedule. His parents had always been there for him, even when he didn't deserve it. Now it was his turn. When Nick arrived at the family home, he was greeted by a whirlwind of activity. His mother, pale but cheerful, was seated on the couch, surrounded by get-well cards and half-empty cups of tea. A young woman bustled around the kitchen, her dark hair tied back in a ponytail. Nick assumed she was the new housekeeper. He approached her with a frown, noting the cluttered counters and unwashed dishes. "Excuse me," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. "Do you always leave the kitchen in this state?" The woman froze, turning to face him. Her hazel eyes narrowed in irritation. "Excuse me?" Nick crossed his arms. "You're the housekeeper, right? This is unacceptable." Her expression shifted from surprise to fury. "Housekeeper?" she snapped. "I'm Kyle Madison, your parents' neighbor. I'm a pre-med student volunteering my time to help out, and you," she jabbed a finger at him, "are an arrogant jerk." Nick opened his mouth to respond, but his father's voice cut in. "Nick, what are you doing?" Beau strode into the room, his face red with anger. Sophia, sitting nearby, looked equally displeased. "Kaylee's been a godsend," Beau said. "She's been helping your mother between classes because she cares. You owe her an apology." Nick's ears burned with shame. He turned back to Kaylee, who was glaring at him like she'd rather be anywhere else. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I jumped to conclusions." Kaylee didn't bother hiding her irritation. "You think?" The tension between Nick and Kaylee lingered like the scent of burnt toast, strong and impossible to ignore. After the disastrous confrontation, Nick couldn't shake the image of Kaylee's furious hazel eyes or the sting of her cutting words. Arrogant jerk. She wasn't wrong, and that only made him feel worse. Kaylee, on the other hand, avoided Nick like he carried a contagious disease. She still came by to help Sophia, bringing groceries or assisting with appointments, but her visits were swift and deliberate. If Nick happened to be in the room, she would excuse herself with some vague excuse about a test or a class. Sophia, ever the peacekeeper, didn't let the tension slide without a comment. One evening, as Nick helped her rearrange some throw pillows, she sighed dramatically. "You know," she began, "Kaylee has been nothing but kind to us. Maybe you should try being kind to her." Nick flopped onto the couch. "I apologized, she didn't listen to me." "You muttered, 'Sorry,' like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar," Sophia retorted. "That's not an apology." Nick groaned. "What do you want me to do? Write her a sonnet to get her attention?" "Dinner," Sophia said decisively. Invite her over for a barbecue. Show her you're not the jerk she thinks you are. I don't think I'm the jerk she thinks I am either, Nick muttered. But his mother's pointed look silenced him. The next afternoon, Nick found Kaylee unloading groceries from her car. Summoning up his courage, he strode across the lawn, determined to make things right. Hey, Kaylee, he called out, offering what he hoped was a disarming smile. Kaylee glanced over her shoulder, her expression neutral. What do you want? Nick rubbed the back of his neck. I wanted to apologize. Properly this time. She raised an eyebrow. For assuming I was the housekeeper, or for being a jerk about it? Both. Nick admitted. I was out of line. I'd like to make it up to you. My parents and I are having a barbecue tomorrow evening. Would you join us? Kaylee hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the invitation. I don't know. Please, Nick said, his tone softer. It would mean a lot to my mom, and to me. She studied him for a moment, then shook her head. Thanks, but I've got a lot on my plate right now. Maybe another time. Nick's shoulders sagged as he watched her carry her bags inside. It wasn't a flat-out rejection, but it stung all the same. Despite Kaylee's polite decline, she continued helping Sophia and Beau with quiet determination. Nick couldn't help but admire her dedication. Between her demanding pre-med schedule and volunteering for his parents, Kaylee clearly had no time for nonsense, and even less for him. But Nick wasn't ready to give up. Over the next few days, he looked for ways to ease her workload, hoping to prove he wasn't entirely useless. He drove his mother to a doctor's appointment so Kaylee could study. He cleaned the kitchen before she arrived, sparing her the trouble. And one afternoon, when he found her buried in notes at the dining table, he offered something unexpected. Do you want help with that? He asked. Kylie looked up surprised. Help with what? Your notes, Nick said, pointing to the stack of textbooks and flashcards. I don't know much about medicine, but I'm good at organizing information. It's kind of my thing. Kaylee hesitated, then sighed. Fine, but if you mess up my system, I'll never forgive you. Nick grinned. Deal. As the days passed, Nick and Kaylee fell into a cautious rhythm. Their study sessions were surprisingly productive, with Nick creating color-coded charts and flashcards that impressed even Kaylee. This is actually helpful, she admitted grudgingly after one particularly grueling review session. Don't sound so shocked, Nick teased. I do run a company, you know. Organization is my superpower. Kaylee rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. For the first time, Nick saw a glimpse of the warmth she usually reserved for his parents. Still, Kaylee kept her walls up. She didn't linger after her visits, and she never mentioned the barbecue again. Nick didn't push. He'd already done enough damage by making assumptions about her, and he wasn't about to repeat his mistakes. But something about Kaylee fascinated him. She was smart, driven, and unafraid to call him out on his flaws. Nick found himself looking forward to her visits, even if they mostly involved trading sarcastic barbs while folding laundry or reviewing anatomy terms. One evening, as they sat side by side at the dining table, Kaylee let out a frustrated groan. I'll never get through all this material in time for my exam. Yes, you will, Nick said firmly. You've got this. Kaylee glanced at him, her expression softening. Thanks. I don't know why you're helping me, but thanks, Nick shrugged. You've done a lot for my family. It's the least I can do. Kaylee didn't respond, but the faint smile on her face told him his efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. Nick had to return back to the city to manage a potential acquisition for Wade Tech Solutions. The emptiness of his downtown apartment struck him in a way it hadn't before. The sleek furniture, modern art, and panoramic views of the skyline did little to dispel the silence. He missed the chaos of home. More specifically, he missed Kaylee. Their tentative truce had turned into something he hadn't expected, a genuine camaraderie. Helping her study had become the highlight of his days, and her sharp wit kept him on his toes. Now, without her sarcastic quips and the quiet reassurance of her presence, the apartment felt colder than ever. Nick stared at his phone, debating whether to call her. He didn't want to seem clingy, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that if he didn't reach out, he'd regret it. Finally, he hit dial. Kaylee answered on the third ring, her voice laced with exhaustion. Hey, Nick. Everything okay? Nick relaxed at the sound of her voice. Yeah, I just wanted to check in. How's my mom? And life in general? Kaylee let out a soft laugh. Your mom's doing great. She scolded me for trying to clean the windows today, said I should focus on my studies instead. Nick chuckled. Sounds like her. And you? Have you been studying nonstop? Pretty much, Kaylee admitted. But don't worry, I'm still using those flashcards you made. They're kind of a lifesaver. I'm glad to hear it, Nick said. And don't forget to take breaks. You don't want to burn out before the big exam. Kaylee sighed. Easier said than done, but thanks for checking in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence comfortable. Nick felt a smile tug at his lips. He hadn't realized how much he needed this conversation. Hey, he said suddenly, if you need help with anything, study questions, or even just someone to vent to, you can call me. Anytime. Kaylee hesitated. Thanks, Nick. I might just take you up on that. True to her word, Kaylee began calling Nick when she felt overwhelmed. Sometimes it was to ask for advice, though he rarely had answers to her medical questions. More often, it was to vent about the sheer volume of work she faced as a pre-med student. You know what's ridiculous? Kaylee ranted one night. I just spent 3 hours memorizing the names of tiny bones in the human ear. The ear. And I'll probably forget half of it by tomorrow. Nick laughed, his deep voice soothing. Well, if it makes you feel any better, I still don't know the difference between a tibia and a femur, Kaylee groaned. You're hopeless. And yet you keep calling me, Nick teased. Touché, Kaylee said, a smile evident in her voice. Their late-night conversations became a routine, bridging the miles between them. For Kaylee, Nick's calm, steady demeanor was a welcome counterbalance to her hectic life. For Nick, hearing her voice made the sterile walls of his apartment feel a little less empty. As the weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. Nick found himself looking forward to Kaylee's calls, even rearranging his schedule to make sure he was free to talk. He didn't tell her that, of course, but he suspected she knew. When Kaylee's midterms loomed, Nick sent her a care package, a box filled with snacks, a stress ball shaped like a brain, and a handwritten note. You've got this. And remember, even if you forget the bones in the ear, you're still smarter than me. Nick Kaylee called him as soon as the package arrived. A brain-shaped stress ball? Really? I thought it was fitting, Nick said, grinning. And don't pretend you're not eating the snacks right now. Kaylee laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Okay, fine. Maybe I am. Thanks, Nick. This was really sweet. It's nothing, Nick said softly. You deserve it. Finally, Kaylee's exams were over, and Nick surprised her by showing up in Maplewood unannounced. He hadn't been home since his mother's health scare, and he figured it was as good an excuse as any. Kaylee was at the Wades' house, helping Sophia with some light gardening, when Nick pulled into the driveway. She looked up, startled, as he stepped out of the car. Nick? What are you doing here? I had some time off, he said casually, though his heart raced at the sight of her. She looked beautiful in the soft afternoon light, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. Thought I'd come home for a bit. Besides, I missed my favorite study partner. Kaylee rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. Well, don't expect me to quiz you on anatomy. Noted, Nick said, grinning. But how about dinner instead? My treat. Kaylee hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but only if it's pizza. Done. That evening, they sat on the back porch with a pizza box open between them. The warm summer air was filled with the sounds of crickets and distant laughter from the neighbors. So, Nick said, leaning back in his chair, what's next for you? More schooling? Kaylee nodded, a hint of excitement in her eyes. Yes, a lot more. If I can keep up, you got this, Nick said confidently. You're too stubborn to fail. Kaylee laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. They relaxed into an easy silence, the kind that didn't need filling. For Nick, it was the most at peace he'd felt in months. And as he glanced at Kaylee, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit before. He cared about her. A lot. But he pushed the thought aside. Kaylee had her future mapped out, and he wasn't about to complicate things. For now, friendship was enough. Time went by. Nick had been very busy with his business. Nick finally took a break from work. He hadn't been in Maplewood for months, but when he returned on a surprise weekend trip, he didn't come alone. Maria Torres, a longtime friend and fellow entrepreneur, joined him for the trip. Nick thought nothing of it. Maria was just a friend, someone he trusted to bounce ideas off, and who understood the pressures of running a company. But Kaylee had no way of knowing that. Kaylee arrived at the Wade home in the early afternoon, balancing a stack of homemade meals she'd prepared for Sophia. She didn't knock, she rarely did anymore, and instead pushed the door open with her elbow. "Mrs. Wade, I've got—" Her words died in her throat when she saw Nick standing in the kitchen with a stunning brunette. The woman laughed at something Nick said, her hand lightly touching his arm. Kaylee froze. Nick turned, his expression lighting up when he saw her. "Kaylee, hey, come meet Maria." Kaylee plastered on a polite smile as Maria extended a perfectly manicured hand. "Hi, I'm Maria. Nick's friend from the city." "Nice to meet you," Kaylee said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She set the meal on the counter, suddenly hyper-aware of Maria's striking features and impeccable style. Kaylee's jeans and faded sweatshirt felt embarrassingly underwhelming by comparison. "Thanks for bringing dinner, Kylie," Nick said warmly. "Mom's been raving about your cooking." Kaylee nodded stiffly. "No problem. Why don't you stay for dinner?" Maria offered with a friendly smile. "Nick was just telling me how great the food is around here." Kaylee shook her head, her stomach twisting. "I can't. I've got things to do." Before Nick could say another word, Kaylee was out the door. The next day, Kaylee avoided the Wade's house entirely. She couldn't shake the image of Nick and Maria together. The easy camaraderie between them. She told herself it didn't matter, they were just friends after all. Nick had never given her any reason to think otherwise. But her jealousy betrayed her. The knot in her chest tightened every time she thought about Maria, and she hated herself for it. "Get over it, Kaylee," she muttered to herself during a late-night study session. "He's not yours." Still, she couldn't bring herself to answer Nick's texts or return his calls. Nick wasn't oblivious. He noticed Kaylee's sudden absence, her curt replies to his messages. At first, he chalked it up to her busy schedule. But by the end of that day, nothing, not so much as a phone call, he decided enough was enough. Nick knocked on her door. When Kaylee opened it, she looked both surprised and annoyed. "Nick, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside before she could protest. Kaylee crossed her arms, avoiding his gaze. "About what?" "About why you've been avoiding me," Nick said bluntly. "Did I do something to upset you?" Kaylee's stomach churned. She debated lying but knew Nick wouldn't let it go. "I've been busy, that's all," Nick scoffed. "Come on, Kaylee, you're not a great liar. What's really going on?" She hesitated, her walls crumbling under the weight of his persistence. Finally, she blurted out, "Fine. I didn't like seeing you with Maria, okay? Happy now?" Nick blinked, caught off guard. "Maria? What does she have to do with this?" Kaylee threw her hands up in frustration. "You brought her home, Nick. You two were laughing and—" She cut herself off, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter. It's stupid." Understanding dawned on Nick's face. "You're jealous." Kaylee's cheeks burned. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Nick said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Kaylee, Maria's just a friend. There's nothing romantic between us." Kaylee looked skeptical. "You expect me to believe that?" "Yes," Nick said firmly, "because it's the truth. Maria and I have been friends for years, and that's all we'll ever be." Kaylee's shoulders slumped, relief warring with embarrassment. "I feel like an idiot." "Don't," Nick said softly. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. But Kaylee—" He hesitated, then took a step closer. "Why does it bother you so much?" She stared at him, her heart pounding. "Because I like you, okay? I've liked you for a while now, and seeing you with someone else made me realize how much." Nick's breath hitched. He hadn't expected her to admit it, but hearing the words sent a rush of warmth through him. "Kaylee," he said, his voice low, "I haven't dated anyone seriously since my divorce. Do you know why?" Kaylee shook her head. "Because I've been waiting for you," Nick admitted. "I didn't want to complicate things while you were in school, but I've felt the same way for a long time." Her eyes widened. "You mean that?" "Every word," Nick said. "I care about you, Kaylee. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time." Kaylee's heart swelled, the jealousy and doubt melting away. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. The conversation marked a turning point for Nick and Kaylee. Their friendship, already strong, began to shift into something deeper. They spent more time together, sharing quiet moments and stolen glances that spoke volumes. Nick stayed in Maplewood longer than planned, reluctant to leave Kaylee now that they'd finally admitted their feelings. And when he did return to the city, they kept in touch, their phone calls becoming more frequent and intimate. Kaylee was still cautious, unsure of how their relationship would evolve. But one thing was certain, she was no longer just a neighbor or a friend. She was someone Nick wanted, someone he was willing to fight for. Nick's return to the city after their emotional confession wasn't easy, for either of them. For Kaylee, every day without him felt like an eternity, even with the demanding schedule of her final pre-med year. For Nick, the polished veneer of his corporate life seemed hollow now that Kaylee had cracked open a part of his heart he hadn't realized was still capable of love. But long-distance relationships were no stranger to Kaylee, and Nick wasn't one to back down from a challenge. If anything, their separation only fueled their determination to make it work. The first few weeks were filled with late-night calls and early morning texts. "How's your day going?" Nick would ask, his deep voice a balm to Kaylee's frazzled nerves. "Exhausting, but I'm surviving," Kaylee would reply, detailing her endless hours of studying and hospital rotations. "How about you? Big tech meetings and city glam?" Nick chuckled. "Something like that. But I'd trade it all for a chance to study anatomy with you." Kylie laughed, the sound easing some of the tension in her shoulders. "You wouldn't last 5 minutes in my world, Wade." "Maybe not," Nick admitted, "but I'd give it a shot for you." Their conversations became a lifeline, grounding them despite the miles between them. Nick sent care packages filled with little reminders of their time in Maplewood, photos, snacks, even a coffee mug emblazoned with "Future Doctor." Kaylee, in turn, sent him handwritten letters, a nostalgic touch that Nick cherished more than he cared to admit. But their newfound relationship wasn't without its challenges. Kaylee's schedule as a pre-med student was brutal, leaving her little time for anything outside of her studies. Nick, meanwhile, was grappling with the biggest decision of his career: a lucrative offer from a rival tech company to buy Wade Tech Solutions. "You've built something amazing," Kylie said one night during a phone call, "but it sounds like you're ready for something new." Nick sighed. "I am, but it's hard to let go. Wade Tech was my way of proving to myself that I could succeed after everything fell apart. Selling it feels like the end of an era." "It's not the end," Kaylee said softly. "It's the beginning of something better." Her words stayed with Nick, echoing in his mind as he mulled over the offer. He hadn't told her yet, but part of his hesitation stemmed from a growing desire to simplify his life, a desire that included spending more time with her. As Kaylee neared the end of her pre-med journey, the stress of exams and residency applications began to take its toll. One particularly grueling day, she collapsed onto her couch, too drained to even think about dinner. Her phone buzzed, and she answered without looking at the screen. "Hello?" "Hey, Doc." Nick's familiar voice greeted her. "You sound tired." "I am," Kaylee admitted, closing her eyes. "Today was brutal." "Well, I have something that might cheer you up," Nick said, his tone teasing. "What's that?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "Open your door." Kaylee frowned, sitting up. "What?" "Just do it," Nick said, laughing. She stumbled to the door, her heart pounding. When she opened it, Nick stood on the other side, a sheepish grin on his face and a bag of takeout in his hand. "Surprise," he said. Kaylee blinked, stunned. "Nick, what are you doing here?" "I figured you could use a break," he said, stepping inside. "And maybe some food that doesn't come out of a vending machine." Kaylee stared at him, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "You flew all the way here just for that?" Nick shrugged. "You're worth it." That evening, they sat on Kaylee's living room floor, sharing takeout containers and swapping stories. For the first time in weeks, Kaylee felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Nick had a way of making everything seem manageable, even the insurmountable challenges of med school. "You really didn't have to do this," Kaylee said as she leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I wanted to," Nick replied, wrapping an arm around her. "You've been there for my family, for me. Let me be there for you." Kaylee looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper. "Thank you." Nick leaned down, brushing a soft kiss against her forehead. "Anytime." Nick's surprise visit solidified something for him. He didn't want to keep living his life in fragments. Selling Wade Tech was no longer just a business decision, it was a way to free himself for the things that truly mattered. And at the top of that list was Kaylee. When he returned to the city, he finalized the sale, handing over the reins to his business partner. It wasn't easy, but as he signed the paperwork, he felt a sense of closure. He'd built something incredible, but now it was time to build something new. When Kaylee found out about Nick's decision, she was both surprised and touched. "You really sold it?" "Yeah," Nick said. "I realize there's more to life than work, and I want to spend more of that life with you." Kaylee smiled, her eyes glistening. "I'd like that." Their relationship continued to grow, despite the challenges of Kaylee's residency and Nick's transition into a quieter, more flexible lifestyle. They learned to navigate the ups and downs together, their bond strengthening with each passing day. For Nick, Kaylee was the calm after the storm, a reminder that love, when built on trust and mutual respect, could weather anything. And for Kaylee, Nick was her rock, steady and unwavering even in the chaos of her medical career. Kaylee's residency program was the most grueling test of her life. The long hours, sleepless nights, and endless stream of patients left her with little energy for anything else. But through it all, Nick remained a constant presence, whether it was through late-night phone calls, surprise visits, or simple texts reminding her to take care of herself. It wasn't easy, but they had become a team, supporting each other in ways that felt natural and effortless. And as Kale neared the end of her residency, the question of their future loomed larger than ever. Nick had been planning his proposal for months. He wanted it to be perfect, not because he thought Kaylee cared about grand gestures, but because she deserved something as extraordinary as she was. He consulted Sophia, who delighted in helping him choose a ring. "She's not one for flashy things," Sophia said, handing Nick a simple yet elegant diamond ring. "This feels like Kaylee, timeless, understated, but beautiful." Nick nodded, running his thumb over the ring. "It's perfect." Next, he enlisted Bo's help in organizing a small celebration at the Wade family home. They invited close friends and family under the guise of a casual dinner, leaving Kaylee none the wiser. On a warm summer evening, Nick and Kaylee strolled through the Wade's garden. The fireflies danced in the twilight, and the air was filled with the soft hum of cicadas. "This place always feels like home," Kaylee said, her voice soft. "Your parents have been so kind to me." "They adore you," Nick said, stopping to take her hands in his. "And so do I." Kaylee's breath caught as she met his gaze. There was something different about him tonight, something earnest and vulnerable. "Kaylee," Nick began, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "You've been my anchor, my friend, and the person who made me believe in love again. I don't want to spend another day without you by my side." He dropped to one knee, holding out the ring. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, Kaylee was too stunned to speak. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, a laugh escaping her lips. "Yes, of course, yes." Nick slid the ring onto her finger, standing to pull her into his arms. The applause from the house startled them both, and they turned to see Sophia, Bo, and a handful of friends cheering from the porch. Kylie laughed, burying her face on Nick's shoulder. "You planned this?" "Guilty," Nick said, grinning, "but I'd say it was worth it." Their wedding, held in the Wade's backyard, was a testament to their journey. The guest list was small, just family and close friends, but the love and laughter that filled the air made it feel grand. Kaylee wore a simple white dress, her hair swept back in loose curls. Nick couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle, her smile radiant. As they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Nick spoke of how Kaylee had changed his life, grounding him when he needed it most. Kaylee, in turn, spoke of how Nick had taught her to trust in love and embrace vulnerability. "I promise to love you," Kaylee said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "On the good days, the hard days, and every day in between." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Nick pulled Kale into a kiss that earned cheers and laughter from their guests. Married life brought its own set of challenges, but Nick and Kaylee faced them together. Kaylee, now a licensed physician, threw herself into her work, determined to make a difference in her patients' lives. Nick, having sold his company, explored new ventures that allowed him to work remotely and spend more time at home. Their lives were busy, but they made it a priority to carve out time for each other. They took weekend trips to the countryside, shared quiet evenings cooking dinner together, and even adopted a rescue dog they named Diggs. The transition from friends to partners hadn't been easy, but it was worth every struggle. Nick loved watching Kaylee thrive in her career, and Kaylee found comfort in knowing Nick was always in her corner. A year into their marriage, they returned to Maplewood for a family barbecue. The Wade's backyard was filled with familiar faces, the smell of grilled food wafting through the air. As Nick and Kaylee sat on the porch, watching Diggs play with the neighborhood kids, Sophia leaned over and whispered, "So, when can we expect grandkids?" Kaylee laughed, glancing at Nick. "One step at a time, Mrs. Wade." But as Nick took her hand, squeezing it gently, Kaylee couldn't help but imagine what their future might hold. Whatever it was, she knew they would face it together, with love, laughter, and unwavering support. Years later, as Nick and Kaylee sat on the same porch, their lives had grown fuller. Their careers had flourished and their family had expanded, with 2 children and Diggs still loyally by their side. The road they had traveled was anything but smooth, but it had led them to this, a life filled with joy, challenges, and a love that endured. And as they watched the sun set over Maplewood, their hands intertwined, they knew they wouldn't change a thing. Their love story wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for Nick and Kaylee, that was more than enough. The end. If you enjoyed this wonderful love story by Green Tea Tales, please like and subscribe. It will help our channel grow. Thank you for your support.